Mike, thank you very much indeed. And can I just say a very, very big and warm welcome to our panelists who have travelled a long way to be here. Thank you very much indeed. And also to those who are joining on Zoom. We are very committed to making this fully interactive, so do please put comments into the chat and WhatsApp me or whatever you feel like in terms of your digital communications. Can I also flag that we're using the hashtag #WealthInfraAPPG tag for tweeting, and it'd be great to get into a bit of a social media dialogue on the very important issues that are going to be discussed today. The session is the first of two we're holding. It's part of our inquiry into the short, medium and long-term needs for NHS infrastructure. We're examining this area in anticipation of the forthcoming capital strategy from the DHSC, which will set out the department's vision for all aspects of their capital spending over the next decade. So this is a really, really important moment in the government's programme for post-pandemic recovery, building on the multi-year capital settlement offered in the spending review last year. That comes off the back of the renewed emphasis on healthcare infrastructure that the Prime Minister himself made since entering office 3 years ago, most notably with the flagship New Hospital programme. However, the capital strategy will cover all aspects of the department spending, not just acute care. With that in mind, the APPG has launched a call for evidence to examine three particularly important areas. Firstly, NHS estates and facilities, especially the primary and community care, equipment and technology used by the NHS, and lastly, physical elements required to enable digital care. Now, we're going to be producing a report containing our findings and recommendations to government, and I'm delighted to say that Minister for Health, Ed Argar, a great man, has agreed to launch our report here in Parliament on July 12th. And I very much welcome anyone who'd like to come to that. Now, you can find full details of the call for evidence on our website, and the deadlines for submission is the 17th of June, Friday, the 17th of June. Please contact the Secretariat for more details. Now, this is our first evidence session, and we're joined by four splendid expert witnesses to speak in the areas we are seeking in. They have very kindly arranged to sit in the order in which they speak, which shows great self-discipline in organisation. Stephen Dorrell needs no introduction, former Secretary of State for Health and Chair of the Health Select Committee. Thank you very much for coming to Parliament. He is Chair of the Public Policy Projects. He is a board member for Languedoc, and he has kindly put on a tie, which I gather is a rare event. Thank you very much. Professor Grant Mills is a prominent expert in the field of health estates and capital spending, as the Professor for Healthcare Infrastructure Delivery at the very important Bartlett School for Sustainable Construction. Sarah Beaumont-Smith is CEO of Fulcrum Infrastructure Group, who are key strategic estate partners for the NHS, and she's also chair of the LIFT Council, the umbrella body for private partners in the NHS LIFT programme. And finally, Robert Eade is head of the Health and Social Care at Policy Exchange. He brings keen expertise to this policy area, and I'm very glad that he'll be doing a little bit of a wrap up at the end. So thank you very much indeed, Robert. So thank you everyone for being here today. We will hear some introductory remarks from each speaker, and then I'm going to be leading a discussion for parliamentary colleagues with our witnesses. We'll try to find some time for Q&A from other attendees as well, but we have a specific set of issues we are seeking evidence on, so I will be running through those questions methodically, but I hope promptly. The APPG is an informal cross-party group. It's not the same as a select committee, meaning parliamentary privilege does not apply to our meetings, but it is an open event, so I would please urge people to maintain normal meeting disciplines. Without further ado, can I ask Stephen for you to make this your opening remarks? And I will agitate if I think that you reach your time.
I shall watch for agitation, James. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you. And I'm delighted that the report will be presented by Ed Argar. He was my successor as the Tory MP for Charnwood before I left both Charnwood and the Tory party, but that's not today's agenda. What I want to do is to, well, firstly, before I start, I should say that in addition to the interests that you mentioned in introducing me. I'm also a director and the shareholder of Evergreen Life, which is a software and services provider to the NHS, and will be relevant. It's relevant to what I want to say. I want to begin a discussion of NHS infrastructure by suggesting we need to frame the question carefully. That this is not, or should not be, a discussion about how we replicate the infrastructure that the NHS has traditionally used in the past, because the needs of the patients of the NHS and the users of health and care services are changing. And it's important that we answer the question seen from the perspective of the people who use the services, rather than simply repeating structures that have existed in the past. It's an old way of putting it, is to say that we should run a national illness service, and what we should be moving to is a set of services that support healthy living, as well, of course, as treating acute illness when it arises. And we should also be using the discussion about health infrastructure to make real the discussion that's gone on for as long as I've been involved in this sector, and that is now 32 years, about the importance of joining together not just the hospital system and primary care and community services, but also the other half of the health and care system that we brigade into social care. If we're to make real our commitment to supporting healthy living, health and care services need to be seen as a single joined up whole, rather than a series of discrete silos, which has too often been the case in the past. And that means that the infrastructure, properly understood, needs to engage the digital infrastructure, because in any other sector, and we were having a discussion, James, just before we started, are we talking about a sector that is special and has its own set of rules discrete from every other sector of the economy? Or are we talking about another sector of the economy where access is an issue, but provision actually is governed by largely the same rules as every other sector? I think the latter is the case, not the former. And in every other sector of the economy, it's regarded as normal that service delivery has been reshaped around the digital infrastructure, whether it's banking or whether retail or indeed manufacturing sectors. Every other sector of the economy has been reshaped by the application of digital technology to an extent that the health and care system has not yet been. So when I say framing the question, I would urge your group to begin with the needs of the people who rely on the services, and then look at how digital technology should shape the sector that meets those needs. And there are two key areas where that's important. Again, they're quite often thought of separately, but not often enough joined together. Digital technology allows a process of diagnosis, which was previously simply impossible, by analysing images, by applying artificial intelligence, by applying a range of technologies to accurately identify early stage disease before it becomes clear in the form of symptoms. And there were some very good articles on that subject in The Economist 10 days ago, looking for the application of digital technology to prevention and early intervention. That's one aspect of digital technology. The second aspect is more familiar, which is that across the health and care system, employing a total of 3 million people in the UK, digital technology should, but doesn't, allow us to pass information from doctors to nurses to pharmacists to social care workers. I would also add to social housing providers and to other public services within a community. So it's both the means for early stage diagnosis, identifying opportunities for intervention earlier than traditional methods allow. And it's also the means by which those interventions can be joined together across the range of possible interventions. So if you frame the question that way, you get to a whole set of different conclusions about where your priorities are. And if you then come on to the question of what is the physical infrastructure, you're asking a different set of questions. For example, just to illustrate the point, and the question, I could go on for an hour and a half on this subject, but one example, yes, one example, if we're moving to a world in primary care of real-time 24/7 exchange between a practice and primary care, rather than occasional reactive interviews, what does that mean for the physical infrastructure in which primary care is delivered, which is the core interest of LIFT? The reshaping primary care has an impact on the shape of the physical infrastructure that's needed. So if I can lodge that point, perhaps I'll stop there. I've got plenty of other points I can make.
We've got plenty of time to return to those. Thank you very much. Rob.
Very much. I couldn't agree more, Stephen. I think it's absolutely critical that we respond to those clinical pathway changes, those technological changes. But I think it's important as well to think about what is a healthcare system and what is the complexity associated with it. There are tens of different specialties that are bundled into a hospital. There's thousands of different activities that are bundled into a hospital. So typical hospitals don't typically exist, and they are very, very different in terms of their nature. The next slide, please. So I've decided to focus just on a kind of simplification of the language because really of that complexity associated with what is a hospital and how do you design for a hospital. Of course, the pandemic changed the way that we think about a hospital, and no one any longer wants to wait in the waiting room for care. And so we also see large patient backlogs that have meant that the system is needing to respond in a very different way. If you see just this slide, we're talking about the severity of a patient's need for treatment. High acuity levels is a critically ill patient and need to have access to ICU care and critically intensive care, all the way through to moderate or low acuity care. What is happening too is the kind of need to understand where we isolate, how we isolate, what is the impact on particular high volume settings like A&E, how do we see patients accessing those settings, what is the impact of the pandemic on those kind of settings. So when we're asking the questions about have we learned, there are very good evidence captures that are ongoing in the New Hospitals Programme about what is the need for learning from the pandemic. But we must work together as a system. We need to understand where are we going to treat patients in the pandemic, how are they going to access care, and how are we going to integrate care across the spectrum, pre, during, and post-pandemic to cope with that. Next slide, please. So we must address innovation, and we must try to think about where care is and what is the benefit of care in particular situations. Hospitals, and the New Hospital Programme is delivering high capitally intensive buildings and high carbon intensive buildings. So we must think about what is that setting and how do we understand the spectrum of care in lower, more emergent settings, and what are the staffing ratios and the workforce models that are driving innovation in those settings. We've heard a lot of talk around same-day emergency care or innovative diagnostic hubs that are higher volume settings that would allow us to diagnose patients with high backlog areas. The example that I pose up there is the diagnostic hub, Moorfields Diagnostic Hub, and the need to see patients in 200-300 patients streaming at a 15-minute centres as opposed to 2.5-hour centres. How do we find more innovative settings that are disrupting the need for hospitals, and how do we challenge and assess and evaluate the hospitals in the new hospital programme to understand what is the impact of what goes on outside in lower acuity settings. I think the most important thing is about the changing acuity. If you're going to a single acuity setting, it's a highly acute incident, you know exactly where you're going. It's a low acuity setting, you know exactly where you're going. It's where there's an emergent acuity. It's a change in the need for a patient to be referred onto multiple settings. And how do we accommodate that in our healthcare planning? Next slide. My principal argument is very similar. Let's do it as a system. Let's think about what does a hospital mean within that system. Integrated care systems, where we should be evaluating a number of different hospitals, a number of different public and community health services within that system. But again, there's no common ICS, so we need to understand what does the capital intervention mean within those systems. One of the questions was, is it just about diagnostic hubs? I think not. It's about diagnostic hub, it's about surgical treatment hubs and recovery hubs. It's about a Christie's specialist hub that is the digitally enabled connection between those. Last slide, and I think you can advance 3 or 4 if that's okay. Should it be publicly funded? I think that absolutely dependent upon political willingness. What does it have to be? Well, it absolutely has to be clinically adaptable, clinically led, and we should be thinking about how capital flows through that system, payment systems that's not just about DRGs, HIGs, focused on operational, but also on capital aspects.
Thanks, Grant.
Sorry.
Am I okay to go, Mike?
Yeah, I'll get your slides up.
All right, thank you, James, for the introduction. So my name is Sarah Beaumont. I'm the Chief Exec of Fulcrum Infrastructure Group. And my experience is really in lift and primary care, but I also represent Meridian Infrastructure Fund, which is a global infrastructure investor. So Meridian has healthcare assets across wider Europe and South America, and is serving around 20 million people. So it has a lot of experience in delivering healthcare and a long track record of doing that. So I think what I'm trying to do is come at it from both angles, really. So I kind of focused on 3 questions in the APPG call for evidence. So I'm just going to run through those. You can go to the next slide. Thanks, Mark. So the first one was, can health infrastructure needs be met solely through public funds, given the impact of the pandemic on government finances? So obviously I represent private sector, and we would say that hopefully not. And I think that the private sector already plays a huge role in supporting healthcare. And certainly from our perspective as Lift, we would say that we have a really good partnership with the public sector, and that has benefited primary care over a long range of time. So we would hope that there was that continued support from the private sector in supporting the NHS to achieve its objectives. But that also, it's an extremely challenging time for the public purse. And so that obviously raises a number of issues. But more than just money, I think what the private sector can bring is skills and expertise. And I think that's an important part of the puzzle. So delivering major infrastructure projects are always complicated. Things always don't go as planned. And I think that the private sector can bring a lot of skills and experience in dealing with those complex issues, whether it be contractual or delivery or operating those kind of buildings. And so that skills and resource has been incredibly valuable. I think for us, we saw it collectively over COVID, that the private and public sector worked really well together to deal with various challenges in keeping buildings operating, and in also retrofitting buildings to deal with the needs of COVID. So converting them into vaccine hubs, testing centers, we were able to work really well together to do that. I think to pick up on the point of technology, I think we've also been working quite well to understand how does technology impact on infrastructure and how can we convert buildings to be able to deal with that, because it does have a big impact. But really, my experience was that it was all hands on deck and nobody really cared where you were from, as long as you could help solve the problem. And that was good. I think also that the private sector can add fresh insight. So, coming from a Meridian perspective, we've got experience all over the world in delivering difficult infrastructure projects. And so we can bring that experience back to the UK in terms of challenges and then learn in other countries, which I think is always valuable to understand. So I think my point on that is really that the private sector has value, not only in terms of money, but also skills and expertise. You can go to the next slide. Thanks, Mike. So the next question was, how can health and care systems best utilize existing fit-for-purpose estate to make best use of available space? So again, I'm coming at it from a primary care setting. And under the LIFT program, I think we learned a lot of lessons over the pandemic about how space can be adapted to the changing needs. And we saw this really quickly, that we adapted spaces first to be hot and cold hubs to support in testing, and then later in vaccination hubs, which they have been now. But I think they've also been used to support a wide range of health and social care services in a variety of different settings. And I think as we talk about more joined up health and care, the primary and community setting, if we think about making people healthier and stopping them going into big hospitals, primary and community care has a big role to play in that. And what we definitely saw is having modern fit for purpose buildings help people get a lot of that care closer to home, so they didn't have to travel far. And I think bringing multiple different services into one setting really supports that. And that's definitely one of the things that collectively in the LIFT community we're trying to do. I think that what helped during COVID was that decision making to enable that, to enable that change, that there was that incentive to make decisions quickly, which enabled a lot of that change to happen much quicker than it may have done otherwise. I think what we've also seen is a shift of the way that people see where they can deliver services. So we see now chemotherapy, renal dialysis being delivered in a community setting, which I think is good for patients. It's a much nicer environment sometimes, and it releases a lot of pressure out of the acute sector. So I think that people have starting to change their mindset about where you would get different services. I think there's still a lot of work to do, and I think it's a dialogue. Okay, just because you put something into the community doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to use it, but it's part of shifting services out of hospitals and having services in the right place. So I think in terms of that, it's understanding what estate you've got where and how best it can be used to serve the community. So the next slide, Mike, is can health infrastructure level up health outcomes whilst delivering the NHS net zero? So that was a bit of a tongue twister. So again, I think if we look at the carbon impact of putting services in big hospitals against the carbon impact of putting them into primary care, that it is definitely more carbon efficient using modern primary care buildings. We would say in LIFT that we have a lot of modern buildings that were built over the last 10 to 15 years. And we're working with new technologies. So
this is what I put in the diary earlier, the pre-meeting. So I'm going to that as well. Okay, right, yeah.
Sorry, we can hear you, but you have to go on mute. Thank you.
So I was just saying that LIFT buildings already include a lot of green technology, and we're certainly looking at new measures to make them even more sustainable in the long term. I think one of the things for me is it's not just around net zero, it's also around driving social value. So that's one of the things that we're looking a lot at, is how can these buildings not only be green, but deliver social value and support in the levelling up agenda. And one of the things that we've been working closely with both our colleagues in the health sector, but also in the councils and community providers, is how we can use these buildings to do that. So running activities to support loneliness or dementia cafes. In one of the buildings we're partnering with a local law school to provide free legal advice to the community. But I think a lot of the time it's just around engaging with the community around that building to see what's needed and how you can best use the estate to be able to support that. And I think for us, because we were already quite embedded in local communities, it's easy for us to do. So that's me. You can put my last slide on. Really just to say that I think the private sector has a vital role to play in the NHS estates, that the pandemic has shifted the way that we think about healthcare delivery, and we should continue on that trend. We shouldn't look to go back, and that we have, relocating into modern green buildings can offer a head start. Thank you. Over to you, Robert.
Robert, over to you.
Thank you. There's been the slide change coming up here. If I get my mouse to move. Yeah. Modern technology and slightly sweaty hands do not make a good combination.
I'm the one directly below, yeah.
I want to do it below.
Sorry, one up.
One up.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's quite right one, but we will do. We will make do. Okay.
Can you go full screen?
I will try my best.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine on this one. So in my 5 minutes, I'm going to address 3 points. What's the current picture for capital spending in the NHS? 2, is the recent settlement at the spending review a game changer or not? And 3rd, what should the government's priorities be, which I know we've already sort of alluded to, so I'll chuck my penny into the mix. The first thing I would say is that the NHS is a real international outlier on capital spending. There's lots of discussion in the media at the moment about shortages of frontline clinical staff. I would actually argue that the shortage of capital is a more significant problem that's had a more detrimental effect on outcomes in the past 2 decades. If you look at recent history, say the previous 2 decades, you'll find that only for 5 of those years has the UK ever reached the average of OECD countries when it comes to capital investment. Outside of those times, and that was during Labour and Conservative governments, it's a cross-party problem. The picture is underinvestment in capital. Unlike, for example, the Blair government, where we added 30% to the workforce, we've not consistently done the same when it comes to capital, and we're paying the price for it now. If you go to my next slide, you can see the picture from 2010 to 2019. So you'll be able to see that the total budget over that time. So each year, the budget never reached 6 billion. And on the right-hand side, you can see that the proportion, the share of total budget never exceeded 5%. The consequences of this have been pretty clear. So alongside that, more than 4 billion was transferred from capital to revenue spending, largely to shore up deficits, a practice that was only stopped in 2019. Consequences have been pretty clear. So in 2017, so 5 years ago, Robert Naylor estimated there was a backlog maintenance bill of 5 billion. Today, it's more than 9 billion. And we know that nearly half of that is high or significant risk, according to the latest releases. There is no traditional commercial business case to justify or to kind of step in on backlog maintenance. Sarah will be the expert to refer to on whether there is one, but from our understanding, there isn't. So that means the state needs to find a way of stepping into that. And that, I think, is just an important reality check on where we are, sadly, at the moment. Because being able to clear, or being enabled to clear through some of that essential backlog maintenance means that you cannot get to some of the more transformational stuff that we've all talked about today, and that is so fundamentally important for the model of care that we want to be delivering in a 21st century NHS. So that's probably useful context for the second slide, which if you go to now. Thank you, Mike, which shows the new capital settlement that was negotiated last November. First thing to say is this is really good news. The capital budget is going to rise by 4.2 billion in real terms. So it's going to be 11.2 billion, you can see on the far-hand side, by 2024-25. It's also arguably more important to look at that box on the right-hand side, because you'll see that the share of the budget, the total departmental budget that's going towards capital is now higher, so it's approaching 6%. Might seem like small changes, but it puts us into the middle of the pack when it comes to OECD countries, and that is really good news. That's also particularly welcome in the context of wider public services, where pressure on things like education backlog is immense as well, and they've got their own needs in their infrastructure space. We've got to situate the arse of the NHS in wider challenges around public service delivery. Is this going to be a game changer though? I'm not so sure. And as the previous slide shows, we have chronically underinvested over the 2 decades. So I think my view would be that this investment atones for previous mistakes rather than delivering new possibilities. So we turn to my final point, what should the priorities be? I think how the government's thinking about it, they've got about 5 or 6 things that they think they want to put their money towards, which would be as follows. Investment in new hospitals, which we talked a bit about. System level operational capital spending. So this is systems, ICS being able to control their own capital plans to do the kind of transformation, maybe more dialysis clinics we were talking about in different settings. Then there's elective recovery, probably the #1 issue that is most talked about, and where they want to do interesting things around cold hubs. Primary care, investment in housing to support adult social care. Stephen talked about it, viewing it as a collective system. This budget will have to go towards adult social care. And lastly, there's R&D investment in new technologies and potentially some more other things. So inevitably, all of these areas are really worthwhile. It's not that they are more or less deserving than each other. The government needs to strike the right balance, therefore. They do need to sadly invest in some of our crumbling hospital estates. I visited some hospitals recently. Derriford Hospital in Plymouth, the residents have been campaigning for a new A&E for about 2 decades. Or the decrepit Hillingdon in North London, where the roof fell in the paediatrics ward 2 years ago. That's perhaps the reason that 17 of the 40 new hospitals are rebuilds, because the places are falling apart. But at the same time, we know that 30% of the GP estate, those with lift sizes under 4,000, will not be fit for purpose to deliver the type of prevention-led primary care in the future. Both of those are worthwhile causes, and the government needs to find a way of doing both at the same time. And that means there's going to be alternative funding solutions, in my view. And I'll stop there. So in summary, we need to focus as much on the lack of capital as the lack of staff in the NHS. It's that important. The recent funding announcement is really good news, but it won't be transformational in itself. And lastly, the government needs to strike the right balance between atoning for underinvestment in the acute estate versus shifting the emphasis upstream.
Very good. Unbelievably helpful. That was all really, really powerful contributions. And in fact, we ran a bit over time, but actually you've addressed a lot of the questions that I think parliamentarians have got for this session. We've got about, thank you very much, Lisa. We've got about 10 questions. And we've got about 40 minutes. So that gives you a sense of what we've got to get to. Some of these, I think, have been quite well answered already. So I'm just going to ask the first 2. And if you don't feel you need to contribute, don't feel you have to. But let me do that. And then after I've asked my 2 and have the answers, I'm going to turn to Philip Dunn, who's got a couple of questions as well, and then to move on. So firstly, what should the next steps of the government's new hospital programme be? And how can this investment be maximised for the wider NHS estate and patients' care? I think all 4 of you in a bit have contributed to that, but if you'd like to add to your answers already, that would be very helpful. And then secondly, what should health infrastructure priorities of integrated care systems over the next decade be? And what do they need to achieve these? But that's a more complex question, but I'd be grateful for answers. So should we go in this instance down the line, and then we'll mix it up as we go along? Steve?
Well, you described the second question as more complex, but in some senses, I actually think it's simpler, because, and I won't repeat everything that I said,
Yeah.
If you focus on what the priority is in enabling people to lead healthy lives, then by addressing that question first in your thought process, you're defining the answer to the second one. If you try to your first question, if you try to answer your first question on its own, then you end up wondering what a hospital is.
Well, I don't want to get into big, but do you think that priority is crystal clear to ICS? Because I just sat through the bill.
No. That's a very simple question.
Right.
I would agree. Capital and capital spending within ICS should be a priority. The backlog level is absolutely right. We do need to address the backlog. And of course, it is an aging estate, so backlog will get worse unless it's addressed. And so we have to talk about the capital versus revenue question. We did a study which was looking at across 120 NHS trusts, and we believe it's around 2% of operational revenue should be invested in that line. That is not being achieved. So they should be achieved.
And do you want to say anything about the new hospital program?
In terms of priority,
Yes.
well, I think it's absolutely understanding the transformation and understanding how that new hospitals program can respond to that transformation with a view that there is no such thing as a general typical hospital.
So I would agree with both of my colleagues or fellow speakers, panelists, in terms of what they said. And I think the challenges for ICS is to look at things holistically and not in buckets, because I think that's what's been done historically. So actually, if we're going to solve the picture as a whole or as a system, we need to change the way we think about solving the problem. And I think the other piece is it's a challenge of timing here. Developing a hospital program it's a long-term way of thinking. And I think traditionally we don't think about building infrastructure in long-term horizons. We think about it in much shorter-term horizons. So I think it's a challenge of thinking on both.
Two very brief remarks. For the new hospital programme, sort of linked to what Sarah said, there is enormous pressure on that team on delivery. And my worry is that they end up being so focused on that they don't have any opportunity to horizon scan and to build the kind of facilities that we will need in 50 years' time. I talked about rebuilds, but really it needs to be forward builds. You can't just have the same DGH that existed before. So they do need to find a way of bringing in some new innovation to correct that. And the second point, just on the role for ICSs, there is a tension around giving all of that power and responsibility for capital to ICSs. If you're a really innovative specialist hospital, Great Ormond Street Hospital, only 4% of their patients come from within their ICS footprint. People are travelling all over the UK to be treated at Great Ormond Street Hospital, and yet you're giving the control of the capital budget to an ICS that will want to understand, but look after their local population. So I think there needs to be a sort of some consideration given what does that mean for our world-class specialist hospitals? What does that mean for the ability to build a new proton beam therapy centre outside of Christie and North London, say in the Midlands? So I think that's a tension that needs to be resolved.
Very, very good. Really helpful. Thank you very much indeed.
Can I just ask a question?
Of course. Well,
You put your finger on it with us, right? You've got a world, just take Moorfield as an example. I mean, I've been to Moorfield. And at that point, I'm living just outside of Bedford, Northampton. And people sitting around where I was come from way up top. Now, what I'm less clear about is on the new programme, is it geared to that strategy or not? Because what I've read, it's not. Am I wrong?
no, I think that we do still celebrate specialist hospitals, and they have their own sense of mission. But Robert, do you want to say a little bit about what your anxieties are about the structure of the new structures that create a new set of tensions in that?
I mean, for very good reasons, it makes there's a persuasive argument to have control capital spending at a system level. Arguably, we've been too focused on secondary and acute care, and that means that you end up with a series of very powerful, influential providers who have large cash reserves, and that means that you don't get the same corresponding investment in primary care. So I think there's a persuasive case for. I think that the risk is that you tilt the balance too far and you take away the ability for a really innovative hospital and a dynamic chief executive, for her or him, to choose they're going to make a strategic one-off investment and find the capital to make that happen.
And I had dinner with the chair at Moorfield, and she's definitely not going to let anyone attack her budget, as you probably know. Stephen,
I don't want to make a long contribution. I understand the theoretical risk that Robert describes, but I want to link it to something Sarah said. That we don't do this alone in this country. Every healthcare system around the world suffers from the problem of over-concentration in the acute sector. So yes, I understand Robert's theoretical risk, but I think we should worry about addressing it when it crystallises.
Right.
I just want to make a comment around Moorfields. Moorfields is an acute hospital that works across 40 settings into primary care. So it is a multi-specialist hospital working in the community as well. So it's not just about
Yes,
big.
thank you very much indeed. I'm going to move things on to the next question. Philip, are you with us?
I am. Thank you very much indeed, Jim, for bringing me in. So I just have to go in a second. I have a question which may not be for this audience, but I'm sure the audience will have a view. Namely, now that we're introducing, as a result of the legislation having passed, a new integrated care board structure, there should be greater coordination and prioritization, therefore, across health economies across England. Will this include the potentially debilitating impact of NHS property services in terms of the ownership of health facilities not within the control of ICBs? And is there any way that people can see that property assets owned by NHS property services which require replacement, and but they're mostly there because they're clapped out facilities which need to be replaced, but the proceeds of sale of those facilities are in most cases essential for re-provision. But at the moment, NHS property services will retain the proceeds, and therefore that does not facilitate this source of funding, given that capital is scarce. Does anybody have a comment on that? Thank you.
Really good question. Who would like to put their hand up for that? You don't all have to answer.
Well, I would assume, as far as we know, that the properties that are owned by NHSPS will remain with NHSPS and will be NHSPS is part of the ICB, so it's part of the discussion of an integrated care service. How efficient, I feel like it's really not my place to say how efficient NHSPS is or isn't, but I know certainly the work that we're doing in LIFT, what we're trying to do is make sure that the facilities that we have can serve the communities that they need to, and work closely with the ICS and the ICBs to make sure that that is an integrated pathway. And I would imagine that NHSPS are doing the same thing.
Very good, thank you. I know Stephen wants to come in as well, but Philip, does that address some of your question, or do you have any?
Well, if you're telling me that NHS Property Services is part of ICBs, and I'm delighted to hear it. No evidence of that at the moment within my area, but that may be because I haven't asked the right question. So I will now go and do that, in which case that's very helpful. I'm afraid I'm going to have to drop off the call. Thank you very much for asking me to ask the first question.
Thank
you. My comment on Philip's question and Sarah's answer is that I think when the public sector thinks about planning its physical estate, it always makes the mistake of thinking we own this, therefore we have to find a use for it. And the right way of thinking about estate, in my view, is to start, as I said at the beginning, by thinking about the service that you're seeking to deliver. And if the current asset that you own is in the wrong place, sell it and and use the money to put the resource into a facility that is fit for purpose. Don't be trapped by the estate you happen to own.
Good point. Brilliant, brilliant. Lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to move on, and I'm going to move the agenda onto digital, and I'm going to reverse the order because, Steve, I know digital is one of your top two key points, but I'll let you wrap up. Question is, what must be done to deliver fully digitally connected ICSs for patients? Robert, do you have anything to add to that, or can we go this way?
You can go that way. Yeah.
Sarah, over to you.
I don't know. Digital is not my experience.
No, that's okay. It is Steve.
Well, so at risk of repeating myself, what I said at the beginning, because in my mind, the ICB it will discharge it. If the ICB is simply replanning hospital services, it's another tier of NHS bureaucracy. It achieves no purpose. The purpose of an ICB is to refashion the delivery of health and care services within its locality. It won't do that if it doesn't think first about patient and public need and second, about how digital infrastructure allows that to be expressed and met. So if you think about the healthcare system as being hospitals and doctors' surgeries, you'll be trapped forever in the NHS of the 1950s.
Yeah.
Whereas the health and care system, the public service system, more accurately actually, of the 21st century ought to be based on meeting the expressed needs of individuals living in communities. And that's a completely different service design.
Fantastic. Well, you've just summarised the purpose of the bill incredibly well. But the discussion about the bill made it plain that that's work in progress. It's going to be difficult.
And that's optimistic.
Yeah.
I just have a thought on it because I mean, I think when we think about digital outside of health, it's digital is about having the infrastructure and having the technology there and available, and then working with people to use that. And I think in a way, what COVID has done is really given us that momentum,
Yes.
in that people are much more used to digital technology in healthcare. And so I think we need to try and use that momentum to continue to drive it.
What do you do about the age group from 60 above?
Yeah.
Who are not, by and large. And they are a primary need factor of healthcare.
It's a really good question. Two answers. Firstly, the fact that there are some people who can't or don't use digital isn't a reason not to design a system that is more effective for the use by the people who do. First point. The second point is that I think actually, computers have been around quite a long time now. You and I both learned to use them mid-career. There's a lot of people in their 70s, 80s, and including my mother in her 90s, who now uses digital technology, who wouldn't have dreamt of it 20 years ago. It is the means by which you can organize social support. The point I did want to make is that one of the lessons, I think, of the pandemic is that in some communities that we're starting to learn how to trust people to look after their own health and to be their own champions, rather than simply be the dependent of a state-provided service where they get what's given.
So you can do. I married a GP at the time, ran a big practice she did in Bedfordshire. And you've got a situation today, no home visits.
Mm-hmm.
Not that, there may be some GP practices, but they're gone.
Mm.
There's no substitute for that other than a 111 call, in which case you get a paramedic. And if the paramedic decides with the patient there, on the limited tests he or she is doing, where do they go? Off to hospital.
Mm.
No alternative.
Yeah.
So I think, okay, so I'm sorry, but I feel very strongly about this.
Mm.
And we are miles away from being able to look after our elderly people. Okay, your mother may be elderly, but if she's really ill and there's no home visits or anything, and you've got nobody else at home, she's a goner.
So our experience during the pandemic wasn't quite as you described. So if you look at the vaccine take-up, which required, if you take the vaccine take-up, where we went through 8 priority groups, which were defined, largely speaking, by age. Actually, we found that older people were digitally engaged. The difference is that there are some people who are not engaged with the health system at all, and many of them have the most acute need. So one group is the disabled. Many of them have genuine economic and physical reasons why they're not engaged digitally. Some of them come from groups like the homeless who don't have homes. There are some like the traveling community and some of our immigrant communities who have never really been engaged with the health system. So we have this really challenging problem that the people who often need the healthcare system the most, particularly the kind of population health that we're talking about here, that is preventative, trying to get diagnosis and tests into people at an early stage, are the people who are the least engaged with the healthcare system. That was the challenge that we found during the pandemic. In other words, age was not the defining issue that we had to overcome. It was questions of disability, culture, and economics that meant that we had to overcome. But the good news is that largely speaking, we did. and it was an enormous, we had to stretch, and we had quite a lot of money at our disposal in order to do it. But we showed that it could be done. I think you wanted to come in as well.
Yeah, I think I was a medical student once upon a time, and I think there's something here about educating doctors. I mean, doctors are educated to treat patients when they are ill. I don't think there's enough, GPs are a small population of doctors. Hospital medicine is the glamorous end of medicine. They want to do all the high technology stuff, but I think there's something about seeing the patient as a whole. And I think that's the point you were trying to make, is training the medical profession to understand the individual before he gets ill. I think there's in tandem something about education, which maybe we need to connect up as well. And there's also educating the public, because people understand the NHS in a certain way. If it's changing, I think, we need to educate the people as well.
Would people mind if I just move the conversation though onto the capital needs of the NHS, which is what the program is about? That's okay. Lord Naseby, we've got you down for a question here. Do you want me to remind you of it, just in case?
Yeah.
Lord Naseby would like to ask, how can we tackle the backlogs in electives, and will community diagnostic centres alone address this issue? A couple of you have mentioned community hubs. I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
I don't think it's we've talked about that. What I don't understand is, where are we doing the trials? Now, I'm a marketing man by profession. I work for the Miles Group. I work for some of the biggest groups in the world. We would never go out and say, this is the answer. We trial, we test, we throw certain ideas. I don't see that happening in the health service.
They did do just on elective work. I mean, we're not going to be able to grow capacity in the NHS overnight, and so they did 160 million for something called elective accelerators, which all happened last year. So various different trusts or groups of trusts were incentivized, for example, Super Saturdays, where you have a particular list in one specialism, you just try and plow through it by doing weekends of it, but where you solely do a single procedure. So I think there is certainly an open-mindedness towards trialing new innovations. I think inevitably the problem with the NHS is that it's very bad at diffusing that. As James said at the start, too often it's seen as this kind of tricky thing that's not able to diffuse it in the way that if Mars is approving innovation, they'd be able to roll out much more swiftly.
As Robert may remember, during the pandemic, we banned the word pilot, because what a pilot did was bury an idea for 3 years. And what you got out of the back of it was a recommendation either for killing it or for doing something completely different. The only way that you could actually affect change in the NHS was to start commissioning and offering people money to do stuff. But that's just the reality.
Go on. I just comment on the trialing different types of diagnostic help. I think is a really interesting idea, and it should be done specialty by specialty. So ophthalmology diagnostic helps all look different from cancer.
So that's what's happening in the 100 trucks, right?
Yeah.
But
what is then the impact of that on Hospitals 1.0 or the capital programme? That's the question I have, is how do you evaluate hospitals based on the innovations that are happening in those trials and tests around those diagnostics hubs? Because they will impact, and they are more innovative in their arrangement potentially.
So in terms of the question is, will the hubs, will the CDCs be enough to get us through the backlog on their own?
That's easy. No.
What else then, Stephen, is needed?
But they do have a role to play.
Yeah.
I mean, the question I would ask around the diagnostic hubs is that if you operate a diagnostic hub on the basis that you still have to go to a GP for referral and you're still passed around the system like a pass, all you've done is put another stage into the system.
Yeah.
And so what you need to be doing is thinking about the pathway all the way through. So defining the protocols within which you might run a direct access diagnostic on some conditions. And provided that that's protocolized and that there's proper audit care, I would argue quite strongly, actually, that provided the link is made between the finding in the diagnostic hub and the clinical record in the GP and in the hospital, big proviso at the moment, neither of those links can be guaranteed. Then what you're doing is redesigning pathways through the system from the patient's perspective. And but a diagnostic hub that simply receives referrals from a GP that would otherwise have gone to the hospital, I don't see what you gain.
And it's an interesting point when you think about technology, because I'm just thinking about as a patient's experience. Hey, you have the NHS app. In theory, you should be able to just apply there that you need to go for an X-ray or a blood test. But in the end, what happens is you have to book a GP appointment that takes 2 weeks to get. Then you have to have the conversation. Then you get referred. Then you have to wait another 2 weeks to get resolved. So something that could, in theory, take a day, maybe 2 days, lands up taking a month, 6 weeks, and all of that has an impact on health outcomes, really.
The diagnostic hubs don't just take first appointment from the GP, so it's not always a referral. Sometimes it might be a follow-up.
And
On a
some might have,
condition, so in which case it might be accessing like long-term condition.
Mike, do we have any other parliamentarians?
Otherwise, Peter Dowd on call.
Oh, great, Peter. Peter, I think yours is the next question on COVID.
Yes, to be fair, I think certainly Grant, Sarah and Robert touched on the answers to that question in relation to the COVID pandemic and how this should inform how the NHS estates to prepare for the winter, so to speak. So I think we've touched on that more broadly. So I won't ask that question. And I think we also touched on the issue about how the health and care systems best utilise the existing fit for purpose estate. So we've dealt with that. I think what I wanted to touch on to some extent is we are dealing with short, medium term, long term needs of the infrastructure. And they're going to inevitably, we've touched on the capital requirements for that, and that has grown and the investment in that. But inevitably, where there is capital expenditure, there's bound to be revenue implications for that. And I think we really need to touch on that. So the question for me, and it goes back to something that Grant touched on about the political will to invest both capital and revenue into the NHS and for these purposes in terms of infrastructure. So my question, I suppose, is, do we accept the current levels and the projected levels of NHS revenue expenditure, given the implications of additional capital expenditure on revenue, in addition to the potential need for further revenue savings, given, for example, that we've got an additional 3 million people between 2018 and 2028 who are going to be 85 and over, for example.
Very good question. Thank you, Peter. Who'd like to put their hand up for that?
Well,
And then
I'm going to be moderately controversial because in addition to being a former health secretary, I'm also a former Treasury Minister.
there we go.
And in my time at the Treasury was the time that the PFI, late lamented memory, was first developed. Now, I absolutely don't defend every aspect of the way the PFI worked in practice, but I do defend the principle that if you want a flexible capital program that reflects all the kind of needs that we've been talking about, whether it's for digital or physical infrastructure, a partnership with the private sector is the only credible way of meeting that demand. And so I know that the party politics have made the discussion of public-private partnership quite difficult, but I don't think there is any resolution to the capital problems that Robert was talking about that doesn't involve redesigning and revisiting the discussion of the public-private partnership that was first dreamt up in my days in the Treasury.
Robert, you addressed this point in your recent paper. Do you want to just say a few words on that?
Well, I mean, so I'll later speak on general practice.
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess we had quite a few thoughts on general practice, so about 26 different recommendations, part of which was linked to the questions that you were asking around access and the type of setting that you receive your care in. Just to go back to the point that was put there in the by you, Mr. Dowd. The issue, the problem would be putting more resource budgeting without increasing capital to a similar proportional level. If that goes below that 6% figure that I outlined in that second slide, I think we have a major problem. We have the same proportion of CT scanners and MRI as Costa Rica and Mexico. I think we're just above Mexico. That is one of the key reasons. It's a sort of constraint of kit that prevents us getting through the diagnostic backlog, which, you know, only 15, I think, or 20% of the total 6 and a bit million are going to go under the knife on the elective waiting list. Most people are non-operative. So you need to clear through the non-operative people first. They need MSK support. They need other kind of non-surgical interventions. They'll need diagnostic tests, which will then go through for cancer treatment, or they'll be able to be discharged. And kit is a key constraint in that. So let's not think too much about revenue and forget about capital.
Very good point. Grant, I think you had your hand up as well.
I do agree that we must take both together, because the question is, if you are introducing capital into that ICM system, will it be more effective to operate? And I suppose if we can't evaluate that, then we shouldn't be doing it, because the most effective way is not spending that quantity. So we need to find a better way of evaluating what is the impact of capital on that system. Just building more, that will increase potentially backlog is going to be add to the cost. If I put into contract 0 back, and it will be handed back in the condition B, that is interesting, isn't it? From a saving a patient and thinking about risk-based approach to policy. So it's important for us to consider that.
Very good.
Can I just ask one more question in relation to this, if I may, Lord Bethell? And it goes to the whole question about the productivity conundrum that we have generally in the British economy. So how do we feel, how do you think the issue about productivity in the NHS can be, do you think it can be addressed quite significantly? Let me put it like that. Do you think there can be a significant increase in productivity in the NHS as a result of a short, medium and long-term strategy in relation to infrastructure? What's its role in the productivity within the NHS?
That's such a good question. I'm going to just be chairmanly for a second and say that we have got a second evidence session on June the 14th, and that will be advertised shortly. So thank you very much indeed. If I may, that's such a good question. Can I suggest that each of the speakers answers that question and makes any winding up comments that they would like in answer to that? It is a good umbrella question. Yes, and we'll just go to Campbell.
To the question, can the NHS improve its productivity? My answer is absolutely it can. But that it won't do it if it doesn't. I'm sorry I'm going to be very repetitive now. If it doesn't do what every sector does when it thinks about the implications of new technology, which is to start with the customer and reinvent the service that use in ways that use technology. We talked a lot about digital. We talked hardly at all about advances in pharmacology and the new forms of pharmaceutical intervention, new forms of non-invasive intervention, using technology to identify opportunities for intervention earlier. That leads to a different shape of healthcare system. Now, that will be more productive in 2 ways. Firstly, it'll actually use, in a conventional economist sense, it'll use the buildings and the people and so forth more efficiently than traditional systems. But much more importantly, it holds the opportunity to deliver better health outcomes. And the true economist's definition of productivity is not more patients seen in the course of a working day. It's better outcomes for citizens. And the concluding thought, my definition of productivity, is to remind people that the one thing 60 million people living in the UK all have in common is the ambition to avoid unnecessarily being a patient of the health service. That's productivity.
And Stephen, in terms of with your treasury hat on, do you think it's a big inflection point change in productivity, a game changer, or a marginal gain?
Well, let me put it this way. Go back to the discussion we were having before. Is health different from any other sector of the economy? All I can say is in every other sector of the economy, the full introduction of digital technology and the application of new ways of working has been a tipping point and a game changer. So it's not yet clear to me why health is exempt from that principle.
Thank you very much.
Just to add, we can improve productivity, and if I was spending that amount of money, I'd be thinking about how can the clinicians do it together with the capital teams to really think about how do they innovate and increase productivity. That goes for net 02, if they know how to reduce the floor plate of their buildings and really think about how they design an innovative service with the right technology. Some of our standards can be 20 years out of date. So building buildings to 20-year out of date standards is not efficient and highly productive. So we must do it
very good
together.
Good answer. Thank you. Sarah.
So I'll come at it from a primary and community care outlook. I think absolutely the NHS can be more productive. And actually, I think in making some very simple changes, it could do a lot of that relatively quickly. I think digital is a big part of that. I think bringing services out into the community helps people's general overall health outcome, and that's got to be beneficial for the system as a whole. So certainly, I think the more that we can treat people closer to home, I think the better it is.
Very good. Robert.
Well, I'd just like Roly Stephen to repeat what he said. So I agree. So perhaps I'll just finish that.
Very nicely done. Peter, do you have I think there's a pretty unanimous view here. Would you like to add anything to that? Fantastic. Well, listen, Mike, were there any other contributions from
We have a couple of questions in the chat, if that's okay.
Yes, if you want to just read them out.
So there's a couple from Jackie here. She says, does the panel think there should be a rural premium in terms of weighting capital allocations for healthcare infrastructure?
Can I just point that to premiums generally? I mean, rural is one good case, but there are others, including around deprivation. Does someone want to put their hand up there?
Well, as I understand it, I think in the current system level allocations, they don't include indices of deprivation. So I think that is a potential issue. Part of the challenge is we're now working at a scale of 42 rather than several hundred. And so it's, within that area, there's enormous range in terms of deprivation. So you can't just say that one part of the country is poor and one's rich.
And a rural, if it's 42, then...
I mean, I guess down in the southwest, they're all rural, arguably, you would say. And so does that mean that they get more of their fair share than some of the deprived inner cities?
I think that's a gentle yes, but.
And there was one more quick one again from Jackie. She's having 2 bites of the cherry.
Jackie, thank you.
So she says, lift areas do not cover the whole country. Does the panel think there should be access to lift partnerships across the country?
Chairman?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe have this.
You know, think they're not.
No, yes.
So you've got a yes, emphatic yes is the answer. In that case, what I'm going to just take a moment to do is to thank very much our panelists who came extremely well prepared with thoughtful comments and a very, very valuable contribution to this call for evidence. Thank you very much indeed. I think it's going to be a really good report. I'm very much looking forward to it and to presenting it to the Minister of State. Vice Chairman, was there anything that you'd like to add before we wind up?
Absolutely. I mean, it needs some thinking. And then you're having the thinking, we need some real action on the ground. I don't like being very within Europe, virtually the bottom. Not quite on every discipline, but we're virtually bottom. I'm not comfortable there.
I agree. Well, thanks to those on Zoom who joined us, and thank you for your patience and for your consideration. And can I say thanks to Mike and the Connect team for putting together a really well-polished session and for bringing together the report. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next time.